Okay, so the next step, we're going to mount our last servo, which is the elevator servo, and this is going into the rear right hand side frame and is mounted using these two screws and these plastic inserts which go the other side of the frames, which these screw through the servo into these plastic pieces. So I'll mount that up. Okay, and that's our elevator servo installed, and if I just show you the other side, you can see the plastic piece that's been screwed into to hold it in place, and the servo output shaft is towards the top, the same as the other two servos here and here, but the output shafts towards the top of the machine. Okay, next we're installing the gyro, and for this I'm using the CSM SL720. And this installs onto our gyro mounting point, which is on the underside of the machine at the rear under the boom. Okay, so here we have the underside of the boom. This is our tail servo here. You can see here, this is the mounting area where we can put our servo, and I'm just going to stick the servo upside down to that. Okay, and there we have the gyro installed. I've taken care to make sure that it's not touching the side frames at all anywhere, and it's got adequate padding underneath it to dampen any vibration. I've also put the lights towards the back of the machine here so I can see the lights when I'm powering up. And the next job is to mount our speed controller into the rear of the frames. I have the speed controller here. I've fitted the motor connections one end and the Dean's connector the other. This is now ready to install into the back of the frames. This is one point where I deviated from the manual. The manual shows mounting the speed controller inside the frames, but this speed controller is just a little bit too big to fit inside the frames comfortably, and so I've mounted it to the outside of the frames, which gives me a much better run on my battery wire as well, which inside the frames you're having to kind of route it around the motor, which I didn't like, whereas this way it keeps all the wires out of the way. It just brings them, nice and neatly down to the front, and then the other side the wires go through the frames from the motor. I think what I may do is try to route these actually inside the frames rather than the way they are at the moment, so poke them inside and route it through the frames, which should then keep these wires nicely away from the side frames. And there we go, those are now inside the frames, and that's actually much neater than how I had it before. So there we have the speed controller installed. The manual showed it inside the frames. I've actually mounted it on the side because it was a tight fit inside the frames. The next part of the build was really installing the receiver into the machine and wiring everything up. And that's what I've done. At the front here you can see a little bundle of wires, and underneath there is my receiver. And then I've routed wires basically down through here, and then they're tied off with a little cable tie here to make sure they can't get to the main gear or the pinion gear on the motor as they go through there, and then they're routed forward into the receiver in there. And then my gyro cables the other side, I've routed them here and then inside the frames and up into the gyro, and the motor wires inside the frames, as you can see there. You can see the bundle of wires up the front here from the receiver, and that gives a fairly tidy install. The only wire I was really concerned about was this one here, and this one goes quite nicely actually inside the frames, and then does miss the servo horn that will be on here, so that's all okay. And the only thing I might do is put a little cable tie around there just to hold that wire back there, just so it can't come forward and get in the way of this arm here. Okay, so that's the radio installation, and the next job for us to do is to fit the horns onto the servos, and then once we've done that, we're really looking at building up the swash plate and linking the rods from the servos up to the swash plate. Okay, so for the next part of our build, we're mounting up servo horns. I'm using a line DS410 servos, and these particular horns are what we need for our particular lengths. We need a 13mm gap from the centre of the servo out to the ball, and with those horns I can get this if I use I think it's the end ball hole, or it might be the one in from it, but one of these end holes. I'll have a measure in a moment and you'll be able to see which one I use, but one of these end holes gives me the 13mm distance recommended in the manual. Okay, so these are the parts we need to install the balls onto our servo horns. For the elevator servo, we have this slightly longer bolt and then this ball with a raised shaft on it which holds the ball away from the servo horn. And then for our two front servos, we have these slightly shorter bolts and then these ordinary balls with just a slight raised piece on them. Certainly not as long as the elevator one. These are both the same. And basically the screws go through the servo horn, and then they have a nut with Loctite on the back. Okay, so there we have our 3 servo horns installed with the ball on them. This is the elevator one with the extended shaft. And I did go in on the end hole on these servo horns for our 13mm centre point to ball distance. So the next thing is to install these onto the machine, and then we can start looking at setting up the push rods and installing the swash plate. Okay, and then we have the servo horns installed. I haven't chopped off the excess horns yet, and I've just set up a basic centre for these servo horns. I haven't actually trimmed these to exactly 90 degrees yet. I've just put the stick at centre and then put all these horns on as close to 90 degrees as I could get, and there would need to be a little bit of subdrum to get these exactly horizontal. So the next thing we're going to do is make up the push rods for these servos, and then we've got to install the swash plate, and we've got to build up the swash plate before we can put it onto the machine. We've got to put the balls around the swash plate. So that's the next task. Okay, so here we have our servo push rods and some ball links. There are actually another 2 ball links. There we go, those 2. And there should be another one of these rods, but unfortunately my kit is missing one rod. So that's something I'm going to have to resolve and order some more rods so I can make up this 3rd rod. But for now I don't have it, so we're going to have to carry on regardless and fit that rod later. So we need to make up 3 rods, all the same length, by screwing the ball links on either end, and then the gap in the middle, according to the manual, should be 0.638 of an inch to 0.734 of an inch. So I don't know what that is in millimetres. I'll work it out and let you know. Okay, so there's 2 of the rods made up, and as I say, the 3rd one I'll have to make up when I've managed to order up a new rod. The distance here I've set to 17mm, which is approximately midway between 0.638 of an inch and 0.734 of an inch. This rod length is going to vary depending on which servo you use. I'm not using the ones that are recommended in the manual, so the length here will vary depending on servo make. So I'm going to initially start off with 17mm and work from there. So the next thing for us to do is to build up the swash plate, and then we can fix these linkages on.